Victoria Ashford stood before dozens of cameras with a smile that dripped contempt, watching as police officers snapped handcuffs onto the wrists of a man in a worn gray coat in the middle of a glittering hotel lobby. That, she announced to the crowd, was the price of daring to stand against her. Ethan Cole did not resist. He did not raise his voice or plead his innocence to the strangers filming him. He simply asked, in a calm and almost gentle tone, for permission to make one phone call. 8:17 p.m. Every phone belonging to every member of the Ashford Global Board began ringing at once. 8:28 p.m. The company's stock began its violent slide. 30 minutes later, the very officers who had handcuffed Ethan turned around and sealed off Victoria's own offices, and nobody in that lobby understood yet that the quiet man in the gray coat had just set an empire on a collision course with its own foundation. The chandeliers above the lobby kept burning bright and indifferent through all of it, throwing gold light across marble floors that had never once cared who they reflected, the powerful or the ruined. And by the time the last camera crew packed up its equipment that night, the story splashed across every screen in the city bore almost no resemblance to the one that had actually taken place. Ethan Cole had never wanted attention. He lived in a modest brick house on the edge of town, drove a truck that was older than most of the interns at the firms he dealt with, and answered his own phone because he had never trusted anyone else to answer it for him. People who knew him only in passing called him the single father who kept to himself, a widower who raised his daughter largely on his own before she left for college overseas. And though she rarely appeared in the story that was about to unfold, the memory of her was woven into every careful decision Ethan made, because he had built his entire adult life around never giving anyone a reason to come after what little peace he had left. Few people in town knew that before he ran a modest continental route logistics, Ethan had spent nearly 2 decades as a cybersecurity and risk engineer, the kind of specialist that Wall Street firms quietly flew in when their systems were bleeding money and nobody could explain why. Fewer still knew that one of those firms many years earlier had been a struggling company called Ashford Global. Ethan had walked away from that world on his own terms, long before most of his former colleagues, tired of the endless hours and the constant proximity to people who treated loyalty as a currency to be spent rather than a promise to be kept. And he had built his logistics company slowly, deliberately, the way a man builds something he actually intends to keep for the rest of his life. His employees respected him precisely because he never postured, never pretended to be more important than the drivers and warehouse staff who kept the business running. And on the rare occasions someone asked why a man with his background chose such an unglamorous industry, he would only say that he preferred work he could see the results of with his own eyes, trucks arriving on schedule, contracts honored, people paid fairly and on time. In the years since his daughter had left for school, Ethan had grown accustomed to a certain kind of solitude that most people would have found lonely, but that he had come to treat almost like a discipline, filling his evenings with paperwork, long drives to inspect warehouse routes, and the occasional dinner with the handful of old colleagues he still trusted enough to call friends. He rarely spoke about his years in cybersecurity and risk management unless directly asked, and even then he offered only the barest outline, content to let people assume his current company was the full ambition of his ambition rather than a deliberate retreat from a world that had once cost him more than it ever gave back. On the evening the story truly begins, Ethan walked into the Centennial Ballroom of the Royal Empire Hotel to attend a land auction for a logistics corridor his company had been eyeing for over a year. He wore no tailored suit, carried no entourage, and spoke to almost no one as he found his seat near the back of the room. Victoria Ashford entered like a queen arriving at her own coronation, trailed by assistants, lawyers, and a security detail that cleared a path through the crowd as though the room itself owed her that courtesy. She was 42 years old and had spent nearly every one of her adult years perfecting the particular art of walking into a room and rearranging the air inside it. Reporters described her as magnetic. Board members described her as ruthless, and the few people who had ever crossed her in a serious way tended to disappear quietly from the industry altogether,
their names fading from conference programs and press releases until nobody quite remembered why. She believed, with the calm certainty of someone who had never truly been tested, that every obstacle in her path could either be purchased or crushed, and she had built an entire empire on the confidence that no one she had ever wronged would find the courage or the means to answer back. The trouble began during the bidding, when Ethan calmly questioned the transparency of the auction process, pointing out irregularities in the sealed bids that most people in the room were too intimidated to mention aloud. Victoria's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes shifted the moment she looked at him directly and recognized his face. She remembered him, not from that room, but from years of watching her acquisitions committee report failure after failure on deals that should have gone through cleanly, deals that had mysteriously collapsed at the final hour because of last-minute regulatory scrutiny. She had never been able to prove it, but she had always suspected one quiet consultant was behind more of those failures than anyone admitted. Now he was sitting 20 feet away from her, asking questions about transparency as though he had every right to. The exchange between them had lasted less than 2 minutes, Ethan speaking plainly about the sealed bids and the irregular timestamps on the paperwork, Victoria responding with the practiced smoothness of someone who had talked her way out of far worse scrutiny than a stranger's polite questions. But something in the calm, unhurried way he pressed the point unsettled her far more than open hostility ever could have, because men who were bluffing tended to raise their voices, and Ethan never once did. She studied his face for a long moment, searching her memory for where she had seen those same steady eyes before, and when the recollection finally surfaced, it arrived with the sting of an old wound reopening. Victoria decided in the span of a single held breath that the man needed a lesson the entire room would remember. She excused herself from the auction floor with practiced grace, stepped into a private corridor, and made a call that no one else heard. When she returned, her smile had returned with her, wider and colder than before, and she resumed watching the bidding as though nothing at all had changed, while somewhere behind the marble walls of the Royal Empire Hotel, a plan was already being set into motion that would end with a man in handcuffs before the night was through. It took less than an hour. A diamond-studded watch worth $3.4 million, Patek Philippe Grand Master chime, vanished from a display case near the auction floor, and within minutes, head of security, Curtis Langford, was insisting that the surveillance footage clearly showed Ethan Cole near the case at the exact moment it happened. Police arrived with unusual speed, moving through the crowd with the kind of urgency reserved for emergencies rather than a missing watch at a private event. And the timing struck no one in the room as strange, because emergencies were exactly what powerful people were accustomed to receiving swift attention for. Ethan was pulled aside without protest, standing perfectly still while an officer explained, almost apologetically, that a witness had identified him near the display case. He did not raise his voice or demand to know who the witness was, though he noted quietly, almost to himself, that he had not come within 20 feet of that case all evening. When an officer patted down his coat, the watch was found tucked inside his interior pocket, gleaming under the chandelier light as though it had been placed there for the cameras to capture perfectly, and a ripple of gasps moved through the crowd like a current finding its path through water. The crowd surged with phones raised, capturing every second, and murmurs turned into open commentary about the poor, desperate man who thought he could steal from people so far above his station. A few of the guests, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people earned in a month, shook their heads and muttered about how these things always happened when the wrong sort of person was allowed into a room like this one. Nobody thought to ask why a man supposedly desperate enough to steal a multi-million-dollar watch would leave it sitting in plain view inside his own coat instead of hiding it or slipping quietly toward an exit. Victoria did not bother hiding her satisfaction. She laughed loud enough for the nearest cameras to catch it clearly and told the gathering crowd that money could not buy dignity, but poverty made a man very easy to turn into a thief. The line drew a scattering of approving laughter from those closest to her, the kind of laughter that came easily to people who had never once feared being on the receiving end of a false accusation. Ethan looked at her without anger, without the humiliation she had clearly hoped to see, and answered only that the truth always arrives, just slower than the lies that come before it. Something flickered across Victoria's face at those words, gone almost before it registered, a flash of something closer to recognition than anger. The officers closed the handcuffs around his wrists as the crowd murmured its approval.
Certain they had just watched justice served swiftly and correctly, inside the back of the patrol car, Ethan sat with the same unnerving calm he had carried through the entire ordeal, watching the lights of the city slide past the window as though the last hour had happened to someone else entirely. The younger of the two officers kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, unsettled by how little the man beside him seemed to fit the profile of someone who had just been caught red-handed. When the officer in the front seat finally addressed him, Ethan made a simple request. He said that under the law he was entitled to one phone call, and he intended to use it now, before they reached the station. Victoria, who had insisted on following the patrol car to the station in her own vehicle, pulled up alongside them at a red light and leaned toward the open window with an amused expression, telling the officers to let him have his call, since nothing he said on a telephone was going to undo what had already been captured on camera and witnessed by half the hotel. She said it the way a person dismisses a child's protest, certain the matter was already settled, certain there was nothing left in this story that could possibly surprise her. And she sped off toward the station with her window still down, humming faintly along to whatever was playing on the radio. Ethan did not call a lawyer. He did not call a friend or family member or anyone who might have offered comfort. He dialed a number that had not changed in over 15 years, a number he had memorized so long ago that his fingers moved through the digits without needing to think about them. When the line connected, he spoke only a handful of words to the man on the other end, his voice as level and unhurried as it had been all night. He said that it was time to open the Omega File 7A. There was a long silence on the line, heavy enough that even the officer holding the phone could sense something had shifted in the air of the parking lot, though he could not have explained why. Then the call ended without another word exchanged. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing but the quiet click of a connection closing. Victoria, catching only a fragment of the conversation through the open door, laughed again and asked what kind of desperate man threatened people with the name of a Greek letter, as though a single strange word could possibly undo the night she had so carefully engineered. She turned to one of her assistants and made a passing joke about theatrics, already mentally composing the press statement she intended to release before midnight. Nobody in that parking lot understood yet what Omega meant, and nobody, least of all Victoria, imagined that the answer would arrive within the hour, moving through boardrooms and trading floors with a speed that no amount of money could outrun. 15 minutes after the call ended, in Suite 4108 of the Summit Financial Tower at 1801 California Street, Denver, Benjamin Ross sat down his phone with the stillness of a man who had been waiting 15 years for a call he had hoped would never come. He sat alone for a moment in the dim light of his office, the city spread out beneath him in 1,000 indifferent points of light, and allowed himself a single deep breath before reaching for the intercom. Benjamin chaired the board of the Sovereign Alliance Investment Trust, a fund so deeply embedded in the financial architecture of Ashford Global that few outsiders understood just how much of Victoria's empire depended on lines of credit and guarantees the trust quietly extended year after year, guarantees that had never once been questioned because Benjamin himself had always personally vouched for them. Benjamin summoned an emergency session of the Trust's senior committee before the ink was dry on the arrest report, and when the committee members filed into the conference room, still adjusting their jackets and asking what could possibly justify a meeting at such an hour, Benjamin gave them only the barest explanation, that a file long dormant had just been reactivated, and that the Trust's exposure to Ashford Global needed to be reassessed immediately. One committee member, newer to the board and unaware of the history between Benjamin and Ashford Global, pushed back briefly, arguing that a decision of this magnitude deserved more careful review before being enacted. Benjamin listened patiently, then said only that some decisions, once delayed too long, become impossible to make at all, and that he intended to act now while the trust still had the standing to do so cleanly. The rest of the committee, trusting the judgment of a chairman who had guided the fund through 3 decades without a single major misstep, voted to proceed. By the time the meeting ended, the trust had frozen every active credit line connected to Ashford Global, suspended its loan guarantees, and demanded an immediate independent audit of the company's finances, a set of decisions that would have taken most institutions weeks of deliberation, but which Benjamin pushed through in under an hour, moving with the certainty of a man who had rehearsed this exact sequence of events in his mind more times than he cared to admit.
Word of the freeze reached the trading floor before Victoria had even finished her drive back from the police station, and Ashford Global's stock price began sliding in a way that made analysts scramble for explanations nobody could yet provide. Financial news channels ran hurried segments speculating about a possible liquidity issue, none of them anywhere close to the actual truth, while junior traders who had built entire portfolios around Ashford Global's steady rise watched the numbers fall with growing unease. Victoria's assistant tried twice to reach her during the drive back from the station, only for the calls to go straight to voicemail, since Victoria had switched her phone to silent, still too pleased with the night's events to be bothered by minor business noise. Victoria, still riding the high of watching Ethan led away in handcuffs, dismissed the early reports as a temporary technical glitch, certain that whatever minor disturbance had rattled the trust would resolve itself by morning, the way every previous scare in her career always had. She had no idea that the disturbance had a name, and that the name belonged to the very man she had just humiliated in front of a room full of witnesses. A man whose quiet phone call from the back of a squad car had already begun rearranging the foundations of everything she had spent 15 years building. On March 14, 2011, Victoria Ashford had been nothing more than a determined young entrepreneur running a company that was by every honest account one bad quarter away from collapse. Investors were pulling out, creditors were circling, and the fraud hidden within her own accounting department was bleeding the company dry from the inside without her even realizing it. She had spent those early years working 18-hour days trying to hold the business together with nothing but stubbornness and borrowed money, and there were nights she genuinely believed she would lose everything she had built before she ever had the chance to prove herself. The man who saved her then was a quiet risk management specialist named Ethan Cole, brought in on a temporary contract to untangle the mess. After a mutual acquaintance recommended him as someone who could see through numbers the way other people saw through glass, he spent nearly 6 months living inside the company's servers and ledgers, tracing every discrepancy back to its source. And what he found was a scheme far larger than anyone had suspected.
A mid-level executive quietly siphoning funds through falsified vendor invoices that had gone unnoticed for years. Ethan built the fraud detection systems that caught the embezzlement before it destroyed everything. Systems so thorough that the company would go on using variations of them for the next decade, without most employees ever knowing who had designed them. He was also the one who personally introduced Victoria to the Sovereign Alliance Trust, sitting across from Benjamin Ross and vouching for her potential with a confidence that convinced Benjamin to take a chance on an unproven company that any cautious investor would have walked away from. Victoria's gratitude lasted exactly as long as it took her to realize how the story could be told without Ethan in it. She quietly took credit for the very systems he had built, framed the rescue of the company as her strategic genius in every interview that followed, describing sleepless nights of personal sacrifice and hard-won instinct that in reality belonged to someone else entirely. When Ethan raised concerns about certain irregularities he noticed in later filings, irregularities that suggested the same appetite for shortcuts that had nearly destroyed the company once, Victoria had him terminated on manufactured grounds, citing a breach of protocol that existed nowhere in his contract, and made certain every trace of his contribution was scrubbed from the official record, from press releases to internal case studies to the company's own investor material. Benjamin Ross, watching from his position on the trust's board, saw the entire betrayal unfold in real time, and though he said nothing publicly at the time, unwilling to jeopardize the trust's investment over what looked to outsiders like an ordinary personnel dispute, he never forgot what kind of woman Victoria truly was beneath the polished interviews and glowing profiles. And he made a quiet promise to himself that if the day ever came when the truth needed to surface, he would be ready. Not long after Ethan's arrest became public, an FBI investigator named Olivia Grant received an anonymous but meticulously organized package of documents that would normally have taken a task force years to assemble. She almost dismissed the file the way she dismissed most anonymous tips, assuming it would be another disgruntled former employee with a handful of screenshots and a grudge. But the moment she opened the first folder, she realized this was something entirely different. The files detailed patterns of money laundering routed through shell companies registered across 3 continents, bid manipulation on multiple government contracts stretching back nearly a decade, bribery payments disguised as consulting fees paid to officials who had approved zoning changes and regulatory exemptions, and offshore accounts holding sums that dwarfed anything Ashford Global had ever reported to regulators or shareholders. Olivia had worked corruption cases for over a decade, and she had never seen evidence this complete arrive all at once, structured so precisely, cross-referenced so meticulously, that it was as if someone had been quietly building the case for years, waiting only for the right moment to hand it over.
She spent the first night alone in her office, simply reading page after page, the pieces slowly assembling into a portrait of an empire built almost entirely on borrowed legitimacy and buried consequences. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she found herself staring at a spreadsheet cataloging years of contract bids across 4 different government agencies, each one won by an Ashford Global subsidiary, at margins so consistently favorable that ordinary competition could not explain the pattern. And beneath each winning bid sat a smaller, quieter transaction routed through a consulting firm that existed, as far as she could determine after an hour of searching, only on paper. By morning, she had already begun drafting the paperwork needed to open a formal inquiry, aware that a case this large would require resources and authorization far beyond what she alone could approve. She brought the file to her supervisor before the sun had fully risen, laying out the documents across a conference table still cluttered with the previous day's coffee cups, and watched his expression shift from tired skepticism to genuine alarm as he worked through the pages one by one. Within days, a small task force had been assembled around her, and subpoenas began moving through the system with a speed Olivia had rarely seen in cases involving a company of Ashford Global's size and political connections.
Nobody at the federal office could determine where the documents had originated, though the timestamp on the file naming convention traced back years earlier, long before anyone in the room had ever heard the name Ethan Cole. As investigators began cross-referencing the material with public filings, the picture that emerged was damning enough that within days a formal inquiry was opened into Ashford Global's financial practices. Victoria, informed of the investigation by her legal team, felt for the first time in years a flicker of genuine fear beneath her practiced composure, though she was still convinced she could manage the situation the way she had managed every other crisis in her career, by controlling the narrative before anyone else could. Victoria's response was swift and characteristically ruthless. She had her legal team quietly approach the hotel employees who had witnessed the arrest, offering settlements in exchange for statements reinforcing Ethan's guilt, framing the payments internally as goodwill gestures rather than what they plainly were. She hired a team of high-priced attorneys to prepare a defense against the emerging federal inquiry, attorneys who had built their reputations on making inconvenient facts disappear from public conversation long before they ever reached a courtroom. She launched a media campaign painting Ethan as a bitter former contractor seeking personal revenge against a woman who had simply outgrown him professionally, feeding friendly journalists a narrative of jealousy and resentment that required no evidence beyond the confident delivery of the woman telling it. For a few days, it seemed to work, and sympathetic headlines about the embattled chief executive facing a jealous smear campaign began circulating exactly as she had planned, with commentators speculating about the fragile ego of a man who could not accept that his former protégé had surpassed him professionally. Victoria allowed herself a small measure of relief, believing that money and momentum, as they always had before, would be enough to carry her through this storm, the way they had carried her through every storm that came before it. But Marcus Hale, the police chief who had personally overseen Ethan's arrest, and until that point accepted Victoria's version of events without question, began noticing inconsistencies that troubled him more each time he reviewed the case file. Marcus was 55 years old and had spent over 3 decades on the force, building a reputation as a careful, methodical officer, and something about the speed and completeness of the original arrest had begun gnawing at him in a way he could not initially explain. The surveillance footage that had supposedly captured Ethan near the display case showed subtle timestamp irregularities that a forensic technician flagged almost by accident while preparing the file for the prosecutor's office, a discrepancy of mere seconds that most reviewers would have dismissed as a compression artifact. Marcus, unwilling to let the detail go, requested the full, unedited recording directly from the hotel's central server, rather than relying on the clip originally provided by Head of Security Curtis Langford. What he found there stopped him cold. The unedited footage clearly showed a member of the hotel's own security team slipping the watch into Ethan's coat pocket in a moment of deliberate crowd distraction, staged with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Marcus traced the order for that particular security shift assignment back through internal payroll and scheduling records, and the trail led directly to instructions issued personally by Victoria Ashford on the night of the auction, communicated through a private message to the hotel's head of security that no one had thought to delete. Once the falsified footage came to light, everything else began collapsing in rapid succession, the way a structure long weakened from within finally gives way all at once, rather than piece by piece. The district attorney's office moved to dismiss every charge against Ethan in a single afternoon, formally clearing his name in a brief statement that made no mention of the chaos still unfolding around Ashford Global, though reporters outside the courthouse quickly connected the dots on their own.
Almost simultaneously, prosecutors filed formal charges against Victoria herself, citing evidence of witness tampering, fraud, and obstruction that had been mounting since the day Olivia Grant first opened that anonymous file. charges that carried the kind of weight no legal team, however expensive, could talk their way around. Business partners who had spent years cultivating relationships with Ashford Global began severing ties within hours of the news breaking, issuing carefully worded statements, distancing themselves from a company they had, until that morning, been proud to associate with. Banks moved to recall outstanding credit before their exposure grew any larger, tightening terms on facilities that had once been extended without hesitation, and major investors began liquidating their positions in a stampede that erased a staggering portion of the company's market value before the trading day even closed. Employees who had spent years believing in the empire they worked for watched the collapse unfold on newsroom screens with the same disbelief as everyone else, many of them realizing only then how little they had actually known about the woman who signed their paychecks. Some had genuinely admired her and modeled their own careers after the confident, unshakable image she projected in every interview. And for them, the unraveling felt less like justice and more like watching the ground disappear beneath a building they had trusted was permanent. Victoria was arrested inside the very lobby where she had once laughed while Ethan get led away in handcuffs, and the symmetry was not lost on anyone who had followed the story from its beginning. She had returned to the Royal Empire Hotel for an unrelated business meeting, unaware that the officers waiting near the entrance had been sent specifically for her, and by the time she recognized the expressions on their faces, it was already too late to compose herself into the calm, unshakable image she had always projected in every interview. And this time it was the crowd of onlookers who raised their phones, capturing an ending no one could have predicted when the story first began. A few of the same guests who had laughed along with her that night now watched in silence, unsure whether to feel vindicated or simply unsettled by how quickly the ground could shift beneath someone who had once seemed untouchable. In the aftermath, Benjamin Ross finally explained to investigators, and later to Ethan himself over a quiet dinner neither of them cared to make public, exactly why he had kept the Omega file sealed for so many years instead of releasing it the moment Victoria betrayed him. Ethan had never wanted revenge, Benjamin said, and in fact insisted repeatedly over the years that the file remain untouched, calling Benjamin every so often just to confirm it was still sitting exactly where they had agreed to leave it, hoping that Victoria might eventually reckon with what she had done and find some way to make it right on her own terms. He had watched her build an empire on the foundation of a betrayal she never acknowledged, watched her collect awards and magazine covers for a rescue she did not perform alone, and rather than tear it down out of anger, he chose to wait, believing that people deserved the chance to correct their own course before consequences were forced upon them by someone else. It was only when Victoria turned her cruelty towards destroying an innocent man's life and liberty over nothing more than wounded pride, staging a false accusation in front of a room full of witnesses simply because he had dared to question her in public, that Ethan finally decided the waiting was over. He told Benjamin later that he had not made the call out of anger so much as recognition, a quiet understanding that a woman capable of doing what she had just done to a stranger in a hotel lobby was never going to stop on her own, and that continuing to protect her from consequences would only mean someone else, someone with far less ability to fight back, would eventually pay the price. Instead, Benjamin told the investigators plainly that empires do not collapse because of a single call. They collapse because of thousands of small lies that quietly accumulate year after year, sitting patiently in the foundation until the weight of them can no longer be hidden. The months that followed brought a slow and thorough reckoning. Victoria was convicted on multiple counts tied to fraud, witness tampering, and the falsification of evidence used to frame an innocent man, and the sentence handed down ensured she would spend a significant portion of her remaining years far removed from any boardroom. She sat through the reading of the verdict with none of the composure that had once defined her public image, and reporters who had covered her rise for over a decade noted that it was the first time any of them had seen her hands visibly shaking. Ashford Global itself did not simply vanish, but it was forced into a complete restructuring under new ownership, its entire board replaced by figures with no connection to the culture of intimidation.
Victoria had cultivated over a decade, and the company that emerged on the other side bore her name in history only as a cautionary example taught in business schools rather than a legacy anyone wished to inherit. Marcus Hale appeared before the media not long after to publicly apologize to Ethan, acknowledging that his department had allowed a powerful woman's word to outweigh the basic principle of verifying evidence before making an arrest. A mistake he promised would shape how his officers approached similar cases going forward. And he later implemented new department protocols specifically designed to prevent wealth or status from ever again substituting for actual proof, requiring independent verification of surveillance footage in any case involving an accusation made by someone with significant financial or political influence over the accused. He spoke about the case at a training session for Officer Tyler Briggs months later, using it as a cautionary example without ever naming Victoria directly, telling the room that the easiest arrests to make are sometimes the ones most worth questioning twice. Olivia Grant, closing out one of the most significant corruption cases of her career, personally thanked Ethan for choosing to pursue justice through the proper channels rather than through the kind of private retaliation that so often destroys the very people seeking it. Telling him quietly that in her 15 years of investigative work, she had rarely seen someone hold that much leverage for that long without ever once misusing it. Benjamin Ross offered Ethan the chairmanship of the Sovereign Alliance Trust itself, a position of enormous influence that would have placed him at the center of exactly the kind of power Victoria had once wielded so carelessly, complete with a salary and a level of prestige that would have changed the course of his life entirely. Ethan declined without hesitation, telling Benjamin that he had spent his life trying to stay far away from the kind of spotlight that changes a person against their will, and that he had no intention of trading his quiet logistics company for a corner office and a board that would expect him to become someone he was never interested in being. Benjamin did not press the offer further, understanding, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, exactly why Ethan would say no. Instead, the two men shook hands and agreed to keep an occasional contact, a friendship built not on business, but on the rare kind of trust that survives 15 years of silence and still holds firm when it finally matters. He returned to running his modest company much as he always had, answering his own phone, driving the same aging truck, and speaking as little as possible to anyone who came looking for a dramatic quote about his unlikely victory. His employees noticed no real change in him at all, the same quiet man who remembered every driver's name and never raised his voice in a warehouse meeting. And within a few weeks, the reporters who had once camped outside his office moved on to other stories, exactly as he had hoped they eventually would. When a reporter finally caught up with him outside the courthouse on the day Victoria's sentence was handed down, pushing a microphone toward her while a small crowd gathered on the steps behind her, she asked whether he had any regrets about not exposing the truth sooner, about allowing Victoria to build years of additional wealth and influence before finally bringing the whole structure down. It was a fair question, one he had asked himself more than once during the quiet drives home from work over the years, and he did not treat it as an accusation the way some might have. Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering that justice does not need to be rushed, only to arrive at the right time, and that he had never measured his own peace of mind against how quickly the world demanded an ending. He added almost as an afterthought that he had spent years hoping he would never have to make that phone call at all, and that there was no satisfaction in being right about what Victoria was capable of. Only a quiet relief that it was finally over, and that no one else would have to stand where he once stood, handcuffed in a hotel lobby for a crime he never committed.
The reporter had no follow-up question ready for that, and after a moment of silence, she simply thanked him and lowered her microphone. He walked away from the courthouse steps as the afternoon light spread gold across the pavement. And behind him, workers were already unbolting the enormous letters spelling out Ashford Global Holdings from the front of the building where they had hung for a decade. A small crowd had gathered to watch, some of them former employees, some simply curious onlookers who had followed the story on their screens for months. And there was a strange quiet to the scene. None of the celebration one might expect from the fall of someone so widely resented, only a kind of collective exhale, as though the city itself had been holding its breath and had finally allowed itself to let go. Ethan did not stop to watch the letters come down.
He crossed the street toward the parking lot where his old truck waited exactly where he had left it that morning, climbed inside, and pulled away from the curb without a single glance in the rear-view mirror, already thinking about the shipment schedule waiting for him back at the office, and nothing more. It was not simply the story of a poor man defeating a billionaire, though that was the version the crowds outside would remember and repeat for years to come, retelling it in dinner tables and in passing conversations until the details softened into something closer to legend. It was the quieter and far more permanent truth that any structure built on dishonesty, no matter how tall it rises or how many people bow beneath its shadow, eventually meets the weight of what it was built upon and comes down before the ones who trusted in the lie ever fully understand why.